Okay, so welcome to Module 2 of the course. We're going to be kicking this module off by combining the fundamentals of C# in Unity and Unity's audio sources together. The goal is to not only understand how we can connect or link a script to a specific audio source in our game, but to also look at what it means to play our audio sources via code. It's also finally time to dive into our tanks game and start implementing audio into it. So the first thing we'll be doing is opening it back up. Now, most games being built in Unity take up the entire Unity project that you're working in and are made up of multiple Unity scenes to separate parts of the game from one another. But because Tanks is so small, it only takes up one scene. So all we need to do is open up that scene. You may remember that our scenes were directly in the Assets folder. So let's go to our Project tab, open up the Assets folder, and double click on the underscore complete game scene. And here we can see a completely new scene with a full working game. Well, it's almost fully working because, as you know, there is only one problem with it, and that's that there is no audio. So in this lesson, we're going to start off nice and easy and just get some backing music playing in this scene. So the first thing we need is a game object to attach an audio source to. So let's go over to the Hierarchy tab and create an empty game object, which we're going to select and call Music Object. Next, let's make sure we have that object selected, and in the Inspector tab, let's add an audio source to it. Finally, let's add an audio clip to the audio source. To find the audio in this project, let's go back to our Assets folder and open up the Tanks folder. Then let's open up the audio clips folder, and here you'll see some audio clips waiting for you to implement them into your game. The clip we're interested in is the one called background music. So with our music object selected in the hierarchy once again, let's drag the background music audio clip onto the field that says audio clip on our audio source. Now, as you know, we could end it here and our music would play on awake when our game starts, but for this lesson, we're instead going to use a script to access this audio source and tell our music to play with. So first, let's unmark the play on awake toggle and mark the loop toggle instead. Then inside of our project tab, let's make our way back to the Tanks main folder and open up the scripts folder. Then in here, we'll create a brand new folder, which we will call audio. And it's inside this folder where we will keep any scripts that we create for the purposes of implementing audio. So let's open it up and create our first C# script. And we'll call it Music Layer. Okay, so once that's been created, give it a few seconds just for Unity to compile your script. Once it's finished compiling, we can drag it onto the music object. And there we go, mine's finished compiling. So I'm going to select music object and just drag it on like that. Great, now the last thing to do is open up our script and learn how to use it to tell our audio source to play our music. Okay, so once Visual Studio is open, the first thing we need to do inside of our script is reference the specific audio source component that we want to control. To do that, we first need to learn about a new form of data types. Up until now, we've learned about data types such as integers, floats, strings, and booleans that we can use to create variables out of and store data in. Well, with the exception of strings, those data types are all referred to as value data types because they all hold values. The other kind of data type we need is called a reference data type. A reference data type allows us to reference other classes in Unity. Now, every component in Unity is made up of its own code containing a main class, just like our scripts do. These classes are given the same name as the component itself, just like how the main class of each script we create has the same name as the component we create out of it. Now, inside our script, what we can do is declare a variable using the name of a class as the variable's type. So in our case, we want to gain access to our audio source component. So we'd start by writing the name of the component, which will be the same as the class it contains. So inside our script, let's make some room inside of our class and we'll write the name of the component, audio source. Then, like any other variable, we give it a name. Because we'll be using this audio source to play music with, let's just keep things simple and call it music. And there we go, we now have a reference variable. Now, just like any other variable, think of this one as a kind of container. Let's say we have an integer variable as well called I. Now we know by default that this variable is set to 0 until we initialize it and give it a number, say 5 for example. Well, a reference variable, like our newly created music variable, is by default always set to null. Now you might remember null from our C# basics lessons. It means that the variable is empty, essentially. And this is important to understand because it's very common for a lot of beginners to think that just by creating this variable, we now have a link to our audio source component. However, what if we had 2 or 3 or even 5 audio sources all attached to our music game object? Or what about other audio sources attached to other objects in our game? How would Unity know which one we were interested in just by using this variable? Well, the answer is it doesn't. That's why we need to reference a specific audio source component and store that reference inside of our music variable. So how do we give our variable a reference to our audio source? Well, the first way would be to set this variable as public. Now, as we learned about in our C# Basics 2 lesson, public variables will be displayed in Unity's Inspector tab for us to set and edit there. So let's save this script and make our way back into Unity. Once the script has finished compiling, we'll see a box labeled music, which represents our variable. Now notice how at the moment it says none inside. Again, this is because our reference variable is empty, so let's look at filling it. Now, all we need to do is simply drag a component that matches this variable's type into this box. So let's come up to our audio source and let's do just that. First, let's minimize the component itself just to make this a little bit easier. There we go. Then let's click, hold, and drag its name into the box, just like that. Notice how it now says music object audio source. This is because when referencing components to interact with, Unity needs to know which game object that the specific component is attached to. Thankfully, however, because this audio source shares the same game object as our script, it automatically recognizes it. Okay, so that was one way of referencing components. The second way involves using a little more code. So back inside our script, let's first change our variable from a public one to a private one, removing that reference that we had just created, as well as protecting this variable from being accessed by other scripts. So to reference a component from within our script, we'll first need to write the name of the variable inside a function to trigger what we're about to do. Let's use our start function so that the reference is made straight away. So let's first write the name of our variable, which is music. Then, because we want to set a reference to this variable, we follow it with the equals operator. Next, in order to get a reference to our audio source, we write get component followed by a less than symbol, a greater than symbol, and finally 2 parentheses and a semicolon to end the line. Now the get component method allows us to reference or get a component. All we have to do is simply write the type of component that's we're after in between the less than and greater than symbols, and so long as that component is on the same game object that our script is, we'll be able to access it. So let's then write the type we're after, which is audio source, like that. So now, when our game starts, on the very first frame, this script will store a reference to our audio source inside of our music variable for us. Okay, so now that we have access to our audio source, how do we tell it to play? Well, that's thankfully nice and easy too. Underneath the line we just wrote, let's make some space inside of our start function by pressing enter at the end of our last line. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all of the components in Unity are essentially scripts and classes of their own that just look a little bit different when we use them in the Unity editor to our scripts that we create. Now, inside of most of them, there are public functions, which are functions that we can access and use in our scripts. Now, do you remember the log function that we were accessing from the debug class in our C# basics lesson? Well, that is also a public function. Public functions, by the way, are sometimes also referred to as public methods. For example, you may see them referred to as such if you read through some of Unity's documentation about their API. Okay, so how do we use public functions? Well, first, let's call upon our new music variable. Then let's follow it up with the dot operator. Now, the dot operator allows you to access something, such as a specific variable or function, from within something else, such as a class, or in our case, a component. Imagine it as a way of going deeper within something. By following our variable with a dot that, remember, now contains a reference to our audio source component, we're able to access things from within it, and therefore from within our audio source. Now, an audio source contains many public functions and variables for us to use, but the one we're interested in is the play function. Before we access that function, notice how Visual Studio first shows us, along with a lot of other options that we can follow from our variable, everything that we can access from within our audio source. Anything with a cube to the left of it is a function or a method, as Unity might refer to them as, and anything with a spanner next to them is a field or a variable that holds information from within that component, or the audio source in this case. Now, this can sometimes come in handy when seeing what's inside other classes or components that are also available for us to use. Okay, so because we want to tell the public function to trigger, let's write its name, which is the word play with a capital P. And because it's a function, we also need to follow it with 2 parentheses. Finally, let's end this line with a semicolon, and we're done. So all that's left to do now is to save our script and test our game in Unity. So now that we're back in Unity, let's play our game and see if we hear our music play. And there we go, we hear it play straight away. Now, one last thing I recommend that you do before we end this lesson is to make sure you have the music object selected and just go to your audio source and pull down the volume to about -3, -2-ish. This is simply so that as we progress through the course and add more sound effects to this project, whichever sound is the focus of our lesson can be heard over the music to help us with testing. And with that, we've just finished the first lesson of Module 2. We now know how we can tell our audio sources to play inside of a script. Now, that might have seemed very basic, but a lot of the things that we covered in this lesson, such as get components and reference data types, are very important tools. When it comes to writing scripts that can interact with other components within your game, these are fundamentals that you need to understand, and are also things that tend to trip up a lot of beginners if they try to skip past them. So I hope that you understood everything that we covered in this lesson. As always, if you didn't, you're more than welcome to go through the lesson again, as well as check out some of the additional resources that I've included underneath this lesson. But once you feel confident, then you can meet me over in our next lesson.